I had such a hangover. Ow. Okay, so we were discussing the winter war last time when I zonked out at some point in the evening, and then I proceeded to have a Zen moment and smoke my entire stash away, which was glorious. Holy hell, it was glorious. So now I'm smoking Bong Tar, which after a night of smoking good quality weed is not actually bad. It's like low quality hash. Taste is not hash though. So we're talking about the winter war, and I get my injection in about 4 hours, 3, 4 hours. And I will be making a video afterwards so you can see what the personality change is. And now that I'm on the lowest dose of the 3 month dosage, the effect should be mild. The second lowest, it still caused some slurring of speech, and at the highest levels, it completely incapacitates you for 3 months. So it's a wide range. So we'll be watching the Winter War, and I will probably be showing some bits about Ukraine and some other stuff, but we'll see.
Oh man.
Bee's nest. The back of the
February
house.
2nd, 1940. In December, the Finns had humiliated the invading Soviet Red Army in the field. But throughout January, the Soviets have been planning and organizing for a massive new assault. This week, that assault begins. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British made a strong step on the road to cracking Enigma, the complex German encoding system. The Russians increased their military buildup in Karelia, the French were bored of inaction in the West, and the Germans were restructuring their economy. They were also still making war plans, of course. On the 27th, the German plans for invading Norway become more formal. It now has the name Weser Übung, referring to the river Weser and exercise. So Operation Weser Exercise. Back in December, Admiral Erich Raeder had brought Vidkun Quisling to meet Hitler. Quisling is the head of the pro-Nazi movement, small one, in Norway, and he helped convince Hitler how vital occupying Norway is. Raeder is worried that a British presence in southern Norway might cut off the Baltic, but there had actually been British plans afoot for more than that, Operation Catherine. This was First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's plan for super armored battleships to launch an offensive into the Baltic Sea. Seriously, Churchill wanted to send in 3 Revenge-class battleships, flotillas of cruisers and destroyers, submarines, an aircraft carrier, the whole 9 yards. The battleships, the Sovereign, the Revenge, and the Resolution, need to be modified, though, since the Baltic waters are...
You know what happened in my timeline when Britain did that? The Germans and the Scandinavians chased their entire navy into a single port in the North Sea. Then they were bottled there. Nobody could take them on because the entire British Navy doing that with a large enough force means that even on land they have enough firepower to deter most ground units getting anywhere near them. So they stayed there. Then the British Isles had lost a sizable portion of their navy, and that was interesting. In our timeline, I believe it was the French and the Scandinavians that encircled them, and some German cities were assisting them. Because once you realize they are in the Baltic, you can place a large enough fleet that you know that with the help of the Danish Strait fortifications will cripple the British Navy but not destroy it in the channels and in the Skagerrak, and then you can wait for the larger navy of people who are now very interested because they know that this will be a once in a lifetime opportunity to actually destroy the navy now that it's bottled up somewhere and can't run and then inflict superior damage on you. So for a while, minor nations' navies show up because they know that this will be the time the empire gets taken down. And then after they organize and gather, you go with most of your navy chasing the British in the Baltic Sea. This is even without the help of Air Force. But once you enter the Baltic Sea, you are bottled in a fashion that if somebody puts a large fleet in the Danish Straits, you will be humped. Because getting in is one thing. But if you did that during that point in the war, and the Germans realized that they can actually take the Danes on in 6 hours, take the Straits, and then use the coastal artillery to destroy the navy once it tries to cross, you would be truly and literally pickled. So no.
Or shallower than the Atlantic. The ships would become slower than they were now, which was already the slowest capital ships in the Royal Navy since they'd been laid down before World War I. But in the narrow channels of the Baltic, that wouldn't matter, and their 15-inch batteries could outshoot German capital ships like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, at least until Germany's 15-inch gun battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz could be completed and commissioned into the German Navy. Churchill saw
Churchill was really insane.
And envisioned these to be
but sometimes you need an insane leader.
That's important. Armor. Churchill thought an attack by air or by torpedo was the biggest danger to the squadron. So they'd have hundreds of tons of extra deck armor and big bulbous blisters added to the hulls to absorb torpedo explosions. They would also be bristling with AA guns. Remember, the Luftwaffe's bombing skills have not yet impressed anybody too much. And the goals? Cut off Germany's iron imports from Sweden, tie down German warships, convince Sweden and Norway to join the Allies, and intimidate the USSR. Churchill has a habit of advocating naval maneuvers away from the battlefront. It was he who had been the strongest advocate for breaking the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli landings in World War I. He's also mechanically creative and was one of the earliest advocates of the first tank prototypes. Opposition to Catherine came from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord. Well, it came from a lot of people, but particularly from him. Armor plating was not something that they just had hundreds of tons of sitting around. Pound also thought Churchill was underestimating the value of air power, especially with the ships moving so slowly in such confined spaces so close to Germany. And if disaster happened and the fleet was lost, Italy or Japan might join the war on Germany's side. Churchill didn't help his cause either by ordering the completion of the first King George-class battleships before Germany could get Bismarck and Tirpitz ready for action, since they used the same steel armor plates that Operation Catherine also required. He'd been pushing for this operation since September, but on January 20th, plans were finally shelved. We've mentioned before other Allied plans for interfering with Germany's iron imports, which partly involved possibly sending troops to help the Finns in the Winter War. They might be too late for that, though. On the 29th, in diplomatic exchanges in Sweden, the Soviets indicate that they are willing to negotiate peace with the legitimate Finnish government of Risto. So they no longer support the puppet Putin regime. What this says is that the war, while still raging in the field, is no longer a war to introduce Soviet communism into Finland, but a war about borders and fortifications, much as what the Soviet demands had ostensibly been about a few months ago. Still, the fighting begins this week. As I've said, the Soviet Red Army has been reorganizing, retraining, and rethinking tactics all month under General Timoshenko after the disasters in December. And the blow now falls. The plan
Kaikki lähtee
The
sisäisestä
Ukrainians
palosta.
are essentially
Ja sitä voi
defending
parhaiten
Helsinki
toteuttaa, kun
or
kokonaisuus on tasapainossa.
Kiev the way we imagine that the Battle
Kun
of
on
Helsinki
sisäisesti
might
vahva,
be going,
uskaltaa
but
lähteä
we're
etsimään omia
not
äärirajojaan.
feeling it. You guys fight there in the forest. Us city folk will be lining them off. Those guys.
Is to ramp up the artillery day after day until a huge and sudden escalation February 1st, when airstrikes also hit the Finns, followed by localized ground attacks. This is not an attempt at a big breakthrough, though. The plan for that is for the 11th, after pounding the Finns relentlessly around the clock. Factored into Timoshenko's equation was a savage but simple truth. Russian units could be rotated, Finnish units could not. The cumulative strain on the defenders was designed to grind them down not only physically, but psychologically by depriving them of sleep, warmth, hope itself. Eventually, even Finns would reach their breaking point. The Finns know exactly what is coming. They can't really do much to prevent it. Their artillery shell shortage is so acute that batteries have orders only to fire when under direct ground attacks. Their air force can, in theory, strafe Soviet supply columns, but the Soviet Polikarpov interceptors make that a seriously risky proposition. They do send a recon plane through on the morning of the 1st that manages a photo shoot of the Soviet lines opposite the Soma defensive position. When they look at the photos, they are shocked to find that overnight, I mean literally overnight, the Soviet artillery has nearly doubled to 200 big guns. And this is just the visible, uncamouflaged guns against that one position. Well, later that day, the guns begin to blast while 500 planes begin the carpet bombing of Soma, which William Trotter points out is the heaviest and most sustained aerial attack in history to this point. The Finnish defenses shatter under the continued onslaught. Phone cables are destroyed. Men are buried alive. Field kitchens can only be used at night, and the smoke from any fire for warmth summons a barrage. So forget about food and warmth. But the Russians are still doing one thing now that they had done in December, taking staggering losses. See, the attacks on the 1st have the pattern: artillery and air, and then infantry and tanks come in, with the infantry assembling, approaching, and charging in the open in dense columns. Finnish machine guns just mow down the Russians, but this time, it doesn't matter. Wave after wave of fresh troops will come on, 5 or 6 waves a day, no matter what the cost. That's the plan. 100 tanks would attack in a wedge, this time working closely with the infantry. So it's now suicidal for the Finns to send out anti-tank squads. And the Finns don't have enough anti-tank weaponry to even approach handling the advancing tanks. The 1st is a day of non-stop fighting, but, and this is important, the attacks are still really only probing attacks to wear down the Finns day after day until the 11th. On February 2nd, the pattern of attack is repeated, only now heavier and on a wider front as the week ends. And the month of January has just ended, of course. For that month, German U-boats sink 40 ships for 111,200 tons, with the biggest successes in the North Sea, especially near the Moray Firth. German Admiral Karl Dönitz has only 32 operational U-boats at the moment, though, so only 6 to 8 can really be on patrol at any one time. Also at the end of January, Reinhard Heydrich appoints Adolf Eichmann as head of Department 4, D4 in Berlin. The designation will change many times and will simply become known over time as the Eichmann Referat or Judenreferat, Eichmann's department to handle the Jewish question. For now, they are to complete the deportation of Jews from the areas Germany has annexed and will be responsible for all future such deportations, both provenance and destination. And one last note. A record budget is presented in the Japanese Diet February 1st. Almost half is for the military, weaponry, and training. We'll talk more about Japan next week. This week, though, has come to its end with the renewal of heavy hostilities in Karelia, German plans proceeding for an invasion of Norway, British plans for the Baltic being scrapped, and Japan planning to spend ever more on its military. Japan doesn't just need military for its war with China. Their puppet state of Manchukuo shares a pretty long border with the USSR. And though there's been a ceasefire in effect since September, that's not the same thing as peace. Could the Soviet Union handle a two-front war with both Finland and Japan? Would they? I don't see why not. And you know why? Because the Red Army is quite clear that its plan against the Finns is to just throw men after men at them, men who die by the thousands until victory is achieved. It's hard for me to even wrap my head around the brutality of such a plan, but if they could do it against the Finns, I bet they could do it against another enemy. If you want to understand more about how the world came to a point where it was acceptable to some to organize ethnic relocations as a state. No, they were at the Pass at Christmas. No, they did not find Mr. Rand. I don't know where.
And Research Corporation, still hiding.
February 9th, 1940. What happens when you go to war and fill your people with tales of glorious victories against an inferior opponent, a weak opponent, but that opponent does not fall, not for years, and even strikes back, yet you continue the tales of glory. Don't mention the setbacks. What happens? What happens is you're in a real bind.
Japan against China. Japan maps looks really small, but once you understand that it's from the northern edge of Florida to the northern edge of the state of New York, then you realize
Soviet
that
Red
it's
Army
big.
had renewed its offensive against the Finns, and the Germans had made concrete the decision to invade Norway. The Allies are thinking about both Norway and Finland this week. On February 5th, the Allied Supreme War Council officially decides to intervene in Norway and send the Finns help. They will land in Narvik on or near March the 20th. They figure the Norwegians and Swedes will do nothing to not jeopardize their neutrality. Allied preparations are, however, vague, irresolute, and amateurish. The pretext of going to help Finland is most unconvincing, and it is the obvious intention to devote more effort to stopping the Swedish iron ore reaching Germany. Well, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain does say that Finland should not be allowed to disappear from the map, but he and French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier agree that it is imperative for the Allies to take control of the iron fields at Gällivare in northern Sweden, and they plan on landing forces not just at Narvik, but also Stavanger, Bergen, and Trondheim. But March 20th? Will there be a Finland left to help by then? The Red Army attacks on the Finnish Mannerheim defensive line that began the 1st continue all this week, with the artillery bombardment increasing day after day. Around just the Summa sector, 400 shells per minute are falling. The Finns are still holding on. Without sleep, death, frozen, and hunger, but they're still holding on. But their bunker walls are being blasted to pieces, and a lot of their positions were not built to provide mutually supporting fire, so they are isolated, and they don't have anti-tank weapons in any real number. So a lot of these positions only have a Maxim gun as the defense. So a couple of tanks parked outside, supported by infantry, can now easily handle them. And the isolated positions are overrun one at a time. Submerged beneath waves of fanatically brave Soviet infantrymen, Finnish fire would mow down hundreds of men in the first waves of these attacks, so that those pressing forward from behind were forced to climb over windrows of dead and dying comrades. As each successive attack dashed itself to pieces, the rows of dead were closer and closer to Finnish lines, until the horror of hand-to-hand combat would erupt. Eventually, every Finnish strongpoint subjected to these attacks was overwhelmed. The Finnish 5th Division in the rear at the intermediate line is rested, but Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim does not send them in, despite the pleas from the men under attack. The 5th is the only division he has that could head in and defend the Viipuri gateway, and he is convinced that the reports of disaster about to fall are just made out of panic, and there has not yet been a breakthrough that requires the 5th to put out the fire. By the end of the week, he has been proven right, as the line still holds, even though artillery shells are so low The order is given to not even fire a single shell unless it is to fight off a direct attack that cannot be fought off with small arms only. But remember, these Red Army attacks all week long are only intended as the prelude to the 11th, when Soviet General Semyon Timoshenko is going to let loose all hell on the Mannerheim line. Joseph Stalin is impatient, of course. Eloise Engel quotes Nikita Khrushchev from his memoirs as telling Stalin, "Our Air Force has been called into action. Many bridges have been destroyed. Many trains have been crippled." To which Stalin responded, "The Finns have only their skis left. Their supply of skis never runs out." Timoshenko was moved in to make changes to the Soviet plans, but someone is being moved out for wanting to do the same with the German ones. On the 9th, General Erich von Manstein is appointed to command the German 33rd Army Corps.
Imagine Scandinavian Union existing, winter war being tense negotiations but no hostilities, low-scale scuffles like you get along the modern border, but no actual hostilities. And Germany gets its iron ore, but as it invades Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg and starts pushing south, Scandinavia does what Britain did in the First World War, which is to say that they are now invading neutrals instead of combat participants. Therefore, it is our duty to intervene. And a million-strong mechanized, motorized, and special forces army starts rolling down the Danish panhandle and doing landings in the northern coast of Germany. Then the Germans move some army to keep them at bay, which they will be able to do, but at that point they will not be able to take on France. Then Italy looks at the situation and sees Soviets have taken half of Poland. Germany has taken the other half. Germany is at war with everybody in the West except Spain, the US, Portugal, Ireland, Switzerland, and from Yugoslavia to the east. So they're at war with Benelux, France, UK, colonies, Scandinavia. And they're looking at it like they took Poland and they split them with the Soviets to take it. And Italy's looking at it and going like, Then it looks like the Germans will be pushed into a defensive war as the Benelux and French consolidate their lines, which, while still being in their territory, are nowhere near what they were in the First World War expanse alone. And the Soviets start looking at Germans, and Italy starts looking at Germans. Then 3 years later, everybody's back to normal. Austria's free, and then an Italian ally, and the Benelux countries are free, and France is free, and Germany is mostly unified and a Soviet puppet, but Poland is free and a Western puppet. There are a few single province states that have been formed in Germany to facilitate the relocation of the peoples without states. We're talking Roma state, Gypsy state, Jewish state. There are a few other ethnicities around at that point that could have used their own state. No Israel in the Middle East. We got Hamburg and most of the northern coast, but we gave them up in the peace negotiations. We were thinking of holding on to Hamburg, but it wasn't worth deck to us to make the effort to actually hold it. So Germany is once again a whole country, smaller again than after the First World War, so the lesson is being driven in. But not divided, not occupied for 100 years. There was no time for a Holocaust, and what you get is the normal brutality of war, but you don't get concentration camps. That's what I'm looking at in my Second World War timeline. That's what I'm seeing there. That's my opinion. because this particular Scandinavian knows what happens if Nazi Germany wins. Because this particular Scandinavian knows enough about biology to know what happens if people only breed with their own. This Scandinavia is aware of this particular phenomena. There's this thing called infectious disease when your entire species or race is close enough to each other in terms of biological compatibility that when you do get an infectious disease, you get a lot of dead. And in our world, there are about 10 groups that we define as races that are sufficiently different in terms of biology of each other that we can talk about some kind of race phenomena. And in a Nazi Germany victory war, we'd be lucky to get 3. I mean, really lucky to get 3. We'll probably get 1 race. Then we'll get one particularly virulent form of influenza and we'll lose 90% of the planetary population. Because our variant of Scandinavia actually read the Mein Kampf, did some mathematical works and charts, and saw what would happen if their outline is followed. And then they went like, we gotta do what we gotta do.
This seems like an attempt to shift him to a less influential post than his former one as Chief of Staff of Army Group A. He's had a lot of influence in policymaking and has been arguing for a radical change in the plans for an attack in the West. His memoranda have tried Army Chief of Staff Franz Halder's patience. Though this is theoretically a promotion, Korps is in East Prussia and will really get Manstein out of the way and remove him from the Western invasion planning. Another German general is in our news this week as well. Last week, German General Wilhelm Ulex in occupied Poland wrote to General Johannes Blaskowitz, his senior officer, that the increase of violence by the SS police units against the locals shows a lack of humanity and morals, and
Ulex was a
the
good
only
general
solution I can see to this revolting situation, which sullies the honor of the entire German people, is that all police formations, together with all their senior commanders, should be dismissed in a body and their units disbanded. So Blaskowitz draws up a list of murders and rapes of Poles and Jews committed by German SS and police, as well as the looting of local property. He notes this week on the 6th that the attitude of the officers under his command towards the SS alternates between abhorrence and hatred. Every soldier feels disgusted and repelled by these crimes committed in Poland by nationals of the Reich and representatives of our state. So next week, Hans Frank, governor of the region, goes to Berlin and asks Hitler to dismiss Blaskowitz. This does not happen. And the atrocities continue on a daily basis, though Blaskowitz, and this is not the first time he's complained, has earned the enmity of most of the Nazi leadership. Ulex will, however, be relieved of his command as general of the 10th Army Corps, which he's held since the invasion of Poland. One invasion currently happening that did not proceed as smoothly as the Polish one is the Japanese invasion of China. This was a time for China of systematic evacuation, not only of weapons, but also of machinery and even cultural relics. Chiang Kai-shek even arranged for the ashes of Genghis Khan to be taken from their resting place behind the Great Wall near Yan'an to a wartime sanctuary in the far western interior where Japanese invaders could never reach. In the midst of being invaded by one enemy, China found time to secure the remains of another, older conqueror. By now, the Chinese winter offensive against the invaders, which had seen its heaviest fighting in December, has ground completely to a halt. As we saw, it had some good initial successes and really shocked the Japanese, being the first large-scale and determined Chinese counteroffensive. But it doesn't really have a lasting impact. Hans van de Ven writes in China at War that a big reason for this was Japan's preempting of the offensive by invading Guangxi province back in November and taking Nanning. This was to cut the Hanoi-Kunming Railway, which was how the Chinese Nationalist Army got its foreign military supplies. By late December, even though Chiang Kai-shek had sent down 19 divisions, including China's only mechanized one, and though they were victorious in the Kunlun Pass, Japan's hold over Nanning was secure.
building an army in China's that particular condition is very interesting because due to the fact that you have had some industrialization at that point, you aren't a Western nation, you can't build a lot of tanks, but you do have some industrialization. That means that a few of the equipment used by the army you can actually mass produce in enormous qualities, like rifles, for example. They won't be Western 1936 or 1939 or 1940 era rifles, but they will be rifles. And you can produce some other stuff like clothing, food, simple hand grenades, stuff like that. But you can't produce things like airplanes or tanks because your industrialization isn't that far along yet. So when you build an army, you can actually build something like 100 infantry divisions for every motorized or mechanized division. But those infantry divisions won't be Native American infantry division militia against the British. It won't be that big of a technological difference. It will be a difference, but it won't be that big of a difference. And your enemy produces top of the line modern stuff, essentially. And when you do get like donations and captures and stuff like that, you'll have just enough to fit a small group up to very high Western standards. And that small group against their individually sized top of the line units will be the actual story, if you will, the important part. If those go well, your top of the line guys can stand up to their top of the line guys without running away, then it's a matter of time until you win.
The Winter Offensive had been a bold attempt to go on the attack, embarrass the Japanese, and seize the strategic initiative. After it failed, the prospects of a second nationalist military buildup were remote. Shortages were beginning to be felt everywhere. Importing weapons and ammunition would also become impossible. However, there's also this. Nightmare visions of scarcity in land and resources had driven Japan to seek the occupation of first Manchuria and then North China. But rather than solving such perceived challenges, Japan's occupation of northern territory intensified them. Yep, it's true. Japan basically became responsible for feeding 100 million people in China that relied on food imports. See, the land, the nationalists told, is food surplus areas, but Japan, Manchuria, Wuhan, North China, these are food importing regions. Last year there were already shortages in the north that required food importing from Japan. Japan shipped in 6 million bags of Australian rice. So what now? The nationalist army is not going to be beaten anytime soon as things now stand, and China itself is the opposite of a solution to Japan's resource issue. Sure, the Japanese can send in a massive influx of troops, and they did hugely increase their military budget last week, but that would also require emptying Manchuria of the forces at the Soviet border, and who knows what Stalin would do then. And of course, the nationalist army are not the only ones to deal with. You have the Chinese Communist Army as well, even if you can get the national.
In fact, you had half a dozen to well more than a dozen factions in China. The nationalists were by far the largest, but it is similar to Washington to Central America, Central U.S. on this map. It isn't everyone.
To the table. Japan could withdraw, but after feeding its public with tales of great victories and a golden future spreading across East Asia, that isn't much of an option. The situation is nothing but grim for either side at this point, with no real ending even remotely in sight. And on that somber note, I'll end the week. The Allies are now determined to interfere in Norway and Finland, but Finland is under heavy attack, though still holding on for the time being. A German general is reassigned, and others voice their protest against the crimes of the SS. And China and Japan stuck. The Chinese have lost a vital military supply line. The Japanese have ever more war material, but the Chinese have endless territory in which to retreat and regroup. And how far realistically can the Japanese pursue them with food shortages draining their supplies? How many times in history have we seen it? The advanced army invades the backward behemoth and is foiled by the endless expanse of land. People just never learn.
If I was playing Japan and it was February 9th, 1940, and I was noticing that the European war was heating up, I would have a very high priority of getting out of anything resembling a war, because at some point the giant is going to wake up. It's not necessarily America. It could just as easily be Brazil for all we care, but the giant is going to wake up. World opinion is going to find who is the one they dislike, and then they're going to murder him and anybody close to him and torch his name for 1,000 years, because fuck war. But if it even looks like Japan's war with China is related to this European conflict, when the giants start moving, and Japan's been industrialized for around 50 years, perhaps 100 at most at this point, while Britain's been industrialized for a minimum of 250 years at this point. So we're talking different calibers. Japan is large, but everybody knows Japan cannot take on, for example, the British Empire alone if the British Empire focuses. So the West is going to find its balance, most likely. They're going to defeat Germany, most likely, because at this point I've read the Mein Kampf. I know he's an idiot, so eventually they're probably going to defeat him, or his empire is going to collapse and be mopped up in a civil war, but they're not going to win this one. And if it looks like I'll be dragged into it, I will be quite eager to make peace. The kind of peace I would prefer with China at this point is something along the lines of a recognition of Chinese control over the islands off the coast, Korea and Manchuria till perpetuity. A war operation from China in the form of the goods that Japan requires to build its industry. And I would keep an occupation army that I would reduce as the shipments of goods arrive. And I would look to be completely out of mainland China in 3 to 10 years. And that would be my stance. I wouldn't immediately walk out with everybody's grain supplies and artworks and shit like that, but I would, like, city of Beijing has paid its share of war operations, moves army half to Manchuria and half to the worst contributing neighboring province. And then I would just slowly withdraw. Because there's this thing that I mention quite often called administrative efficiency. And when you have this thing called a core territory, which is what everybody considers to be your natural use state, and if you expand larger than that state, your administrative efficiency will be pushed. And as it reduces, your economy essentially goes to shit. So you have to keep a high administrative efficiency. So I would, as Japan, be cautious at looking at territories larger than what I at that point had. Then I would shift a massive amount of support for French Indochina and Dutch East Indies to declare independence into native controlled states, and instead of like South Africa's Boer state, essentially. I would try to kick the Westerners out of that region like that. I would literally ship 1 million infantry weapons to the local militias as I withdraw from China. That's what I'd do. I'd keep the Japanese out of there. make the Western countries explain why they have colonies if they're supposed to be fighting against the bad guy. Then, if those countries start to gain their independence, I would switch my efforts into supporting the Western allies against Germany in exchange for, faster decolonization, better participation of outside Europe and northern parts of the planet in the following UN, etc., etc. Stuff like that. Then in like 1960s to 1980s, I'd be looking at autonomy for Manchuria and Korea, and by at the latest 2010, most likely by 2000, I would be looking at full independence for both. Because after a certain period of being under somebody else's control for the reason of making them economically better, and the somebody who's under control you are is significantly larger than you in terms of economy, your economy will be so geared to be integrated to the former lord's economy that even if you are fully independent, there's very little you can do, especially quickly, to like disentangle yourself from your former occupier. Which means that if Korea had been held for like 100 years, making from their industry the goods that the Japanese can't make, that they actually need from the mainland, then even after independence, they'd be very well off, very well off. Then, as Japan would slowly increase, as technology increases its domestic synthetic capability for the goods that they'd prefer to be able to make domestically, Korea could still sell most of its goods to other countries, assuming Japan had kept a high quality, which in my gameplays is most often true. If it was low quality, then they could be like the Lada industry of Russia, but they'd still make a lot of money based on what they could mass produce for their former allies in stock. And then once the alliance collapsed, what they could sell to the entire world market of the stuff that they used to only make for their allies, essentially. Which is why we still have such car companies around as Lada, even though they're producing stuff that we would have built in the 50s. The factories that produce them are so massively efficient and so massively well maintained because they used to be a national security interest that just running them dry will take 100 years. So there's a lot of stuff when you have a collapsed empire that makes you quite powerful for quite a long time. You have the kind of depth that if you're actually engaged in a war for survival, you'll be able to do a lot. Border conflicts here and there aren't your forte. Getting pushed into a total survival conflict, that's your forte. That's what I'm seeing here, though. What I'm seeing here is closer to forming a hybrid culture instead of a war for survival where only one culture will survive. I doubt that Russia going for complete control, which seems what they're going for, of their population in a centralization type move. I doubt that that will retain the Russian culture without generating a hybrid Russian culture. So I would say that this looks more like a hybridization of the Russian culture with its opposing former Warsaw Pact nations, where the winner is undetermined this time. Because it needs to be defined what is to win in this conflict. thus far, the world culture has been reluctant to learn Russian values because learning means you're able to combat them, and they've preferred to keep Russia as a spiritual force, is perhaps the word I'd use, instead of a physical force. They've preferred to keep it as a religious icon, if you will. Now that it seems that we are in a situation where learning of Russia again is profitable, it seems like many people are resistant to giving Russia true attributes, but it seems like they'll be able to do it anyway. We'll see what occurs. I'm still looking at least a month until Ukraine falls. I initially gave it a week, but their counteroffensives have been so spot on that it looks like it'll take about a month. And it's possible that might not even fall. It depends very much on how well they'll gear up. Intia, Kiina ja Japani pysyy tuosta lännen sisäisestä jutusta tällä hetkellä ehossa. Kyllä Japani ja Kiina jotakin tekee, mutta näyttää kummatkin siltä, että ne on aika sillä, että ne ei halua ottaa kunnon kantaa. Kiina ja Intia ei ainakaan ota. Se on ihan selvä juttu. Tämä on niin lännen sisäinen juttu, että tähän on parempi olla sotkeutumatta. Tämä on tämä, kun Yhdysvallat kävi sen terrorismin vastaisen sodan ja keräsi sen War Exhaustionin sinne huippuunsa ihan vaan vetämällä persettä sitä maaperää edestakas. Ne ei oikein koskaan saanut sitä mentaliteettia, minkä ne Japanille sai, että ne rakentaa siitä ihan semmoisen länsimaisen, semmoisen huippumodernin. Niin ne vaan hilasi sitä annustaan siellä edestakas ja keräsi sitä War Exhaustionia. Sitten kun se käppäsi, niin sitten se vetäytyi sieltä ja nyt ne on joku puoli vuotta laskenut siitä, kun tuommoisessa saattaa mennä 5 vuotta ja 20 vuotta, että sitä laskee, että on taas iskutehon. Ja sitten siihen samaan kohtaan, niin sitten tämä Venäjä alkoi vähän sillä, että nyt olisi hyvä ikkuna alkaa aukomaan päätään. Niin se on vähän semmoinen stereotyyppinen. Nyt olisi oikein hyvä tilanne niin myydä lännelle turvallisuuspalveluita esimerkiksi. Kaikkea koulutuspalvelua, Arctic Warfare Experience ja tämmöistä olisi niinku, siis ihan ilman tätä sotaa. Sitä on nytkin Venäjä myynyt sitä satelliittia ja avaruuslaukaisuteknologiaa niin paljon, ettei vittu mitään. vaan vähitellen tällä kartalla niin paljastumaan. Se on mun mielestä ihan hyvä juttu, niin saa itsestäkin tietoja. Ruotsalaiset ja sitten tanskalaiset ja norjalaiset puhuu suomalaisille siitä, että ei niin kuin tämä henkilö eli minä, niin ei tämä kyllä mitään suomea puhu. Se ruottiakaan puhu, mutta se kun kuuntelee ulkopuolisena, että miltä suomalaiset kuulostaa ja sitten kuuntelee tätä, niin sanoo, että ei tämä kyllä suomea puhu. Siinä on joku semmoinen, että se kuulostaa suomelta, jos on länsiaksentti. Se kuulostaa niin kuin jotenkin länsi-suomelta. Siinä on paljon semmoisia, niin että miten se sana seuraa sitä seuraavaa sanaa, sitä nuottia, jos puuttuu se semmoinen suomalaistyylinen, vähän niin kuin itään kattova melankolia. Niin sitten puuttuu semmoinen. Niin se ei kuulosta, kun se kuulostaa vähän semmoiselta niin kuin Western Noble Swedish Finnish, vaikka siis tässä tapauksessa hyvin selvästi ei puhu ruottia. Vaan jotain sillä, että ruottalaiset tuntee luissaan, että ne tunnistaa sen kielen, mutta ne ei sano, että se ei niin kuin ole ihan niin kuin suomi. Se ei ole myöskään mikään semmoinen, minkä he julkisessa dialogissa assosioisi johonkin antiikin Suomen mutaatioon, vaan se tuntuu olevan ihan joku niin kuin uusi variaatio. Ei välttämättä sillä lailla uusi, kun se tuntuu hirveän tutulta. Mutta niin kuin kuitenkin mä sanoisin, että se on toi, että mä katson tota Skandinaavia unionia. Mä sanoisin, että se on se. Kun mulla on siinä semmoinen, että see me as one of your own. Semmoinen, että mikä sille kovemmille laitetaan. Niin sit kun joku katsoo, niin siitä tulee tutun oloinen, mutta ulkopuolinen ja sillä että se ei ole ihan niin kuin Suomea, vaan ihan kuin se olisi jotain Länsi-Suomea. Ja norjalaiset sanoo, että se kuulostaa heille ihan kuin se olisi niin kuin Ruotsin ja Norjan rajalla ja siinä Norjan puolella, mutta sillä että niin kuin pidemmällä. Et se kuulostaa siltä, miltä siinä rajalla niin kuin periaatteessa kuulostaa, mutta se tuntuu siltä, että se on kauempana, mutta se myös tuntuu siltä, että se on niin kuin ihan siinä ennen kuin se muuttuu ruotsiksi. Mikä on just se, mitä mä toivoinkin, että se vaikuttaa. Koska siitä se viittaa siihen, että jos kaikki vaan puhuu omaa äidinkieltään ja sitten tekee sen Crusader Kingsin ton language learning scheman, eli siis jokainen oppii sieltä täältä niitä lähialueen muita kieliä, niin siitä tulee semmoinen, että kun ne puhuu keskenään sit siellä perheessä ja siellä hovissa, niin ne käyttää niitä osaamia sanoja niistä lähikulttuureista ja sitten niinku peilailee, että mihin ne sanat osuu, niin se koko kulttuuri vähän niinku tiedostaa sen, että miltä ne lähialueet kuulostaa. Kun jokainen osaa sanan sieltä ja toisen täältä niitä muiden kulttuureita ja osaa vähintään 2-3 alueen omaa kieltä, niin siitä tulee semmoinen, että ne niinku puhuu sitä omaa kieltä, mutta sitten kun pitää alkaa keskittyä, niin pystyy puhumaan sitä toistakin, että siitä tulee semmoinen slangin muoto. Ja kaikki on sillä lailla, että niillä on omat kirjakielet ja mä oon huomannut, että on jopa tullut ehkä 3 tai 4, jos katsotaan sillä, että Baltiaakin katsotaan, niin niitä kirjakieliä, mitä ne käyttää tuon mutaatioyhteydessä. Siinä on semmoinen, että Suomella, Saamella, Karjalalla ja Itä-Ruotsilla on yhteinen kirjakieli. Sitten Keski-Ruotsilla, Skaanella, Norjan keskirannikolla ja sitten osalla saamelaisista niin on yksi kieli. Sitten rannikkonorjalaisilla ja tanskalaisilla niin on yksi kieli ja sitten virolaisilla ja sitten eteläsuomalaisilla on niin kuin periaatteessa yksi kieli ja sitten jos saamelaiset katsotaan, niin sitten niillä on yksi kieli. Nyt siellä alueella on 8 kieltä vähintään. Jos katsotaan ne lokaalivariaatiot, jotka pitää itseään Nordic Balticateissa kielinä, niin kyllä niitä silloin on vähintään 8. Meillä on nyt tuossa mallissa 4 tai 5. Mun mielestä. Se näyttäisi hyvältä. Okay. Joo, toi kuulostaa ihan järkevältä. Silloin me päästään saamelaisten itsenäistymisessä niin jostain 1960-luvulta niin jonnekin 1200-luvulle, missä me voidaan sanoa, että meidän aikajanassa ne on ensimmäisen kerran saavuttanut jotain muutakin kuin sen, että ne on semmoisia rivaalisia heimoja, että niillä on joku semmoinen, että ulkomaat katsoo, tai tuossa on toi teidän talo, kun ne sai ne saamelaiskäräjät sillä lailla, että se oli kaikkien niiden lähialueiden valtioiden ja sitten myös globaalin tunnistama. Niin mun mielestä se on se itsenäistymispäivä. Niin me saadaan se, jos me pelataan toi Crusader Kings nyt sillä lailla, miten me tässä näyttää siltä, että me pelataan, niin me saadaan se sinne jonnekin 1200-luvulle. Se onnistuu vaan sillä lailla, että sit kun me tehdään se saamelaisten chiefdomista duchiksi nosto, niin se duchin johtaja pitää olla saamelaistaustainen ja saamenkielinen. Muuten se ei onnistu. Muuten se on vaan valtaus. Niin, sitten ne on täysin itsenäisiä, niin sitten siinä käy sillä, että vaikka ne kuuluu siihen Finlandin kuningaskuntaan, niin ne tekee kaikki niin kuin talot itse ja niillä on omat ulkopolitiikat ja armeijat ja kauppapolitiikat ja kielipolitiikat ja hallintopolitiikat ja hovit ja kaikki. Ainoa mitä se ylempi tekee, niin on se, että se ottaa joku 10% niistä tuotoista ja sitten pistää sillä, että se pystyy hätätapauksessa pyytämään niitä mobilisoitumaan, mutta sitäkään ei pysty pakottaa tekemään. Ja sitten siihen omaan hoviinsa, niin se saattaa sieltä alemmasta hovista niin palkata niitä parhaimpia sillä, tulkaa mieluummin tänne tekee työt. Niin sillä ne alemmat aateliset pääsee sinne korkeampaan hoviin. Sitten niitä voi tehdä niitä royal marriage, jossa niitä omia hovin työntekijöitä, jotka kuuluu niin kuin periaatteessa kuitenkin siihen sukuun, kun ne kuuluu siihen ryhmään. Niin niitä paritetaan niille muille ja nostetaan niitä, että kuinka sitten jos kuolee vaikka 10% kaikki hovin korkeimmat, niin kuka perii minkäkin tontin mistäkin, niin kun saat sen kanssa royal marriageissa, niin se sun rintaperillinen, niin se sun rintaperillinen, jos sä et pätkääkään välitä, niin saattaa yhtäkkiä olla joku, tiedäks, vaikka Uudenmaan läänin ruhtinas esimerkiksi. Niin sen takia, kun tekee niitä royal marriageja, niin kannattaa vähän katsoa sillä, että ne on semmoisia tyyppejä, joiden niin uskookin sillä, että jos ne saa sen alueen hallintaan, niin ne toimii järkevästi. Feodalismissa on omat etunsa. Ja sitten kun se menee sillä, että jos se johtaja kuolee ja silloin niitä lapsia, niin lapset ja sitten rintaperilliset eli veljekset ja siskot niin saa jonkun verran sitä plottia. Ja sitten jos siinä käy sillä, että niiden royal marriage ja niiden kautta tulee sillä, että se on myös se perintöoikeudellinen sille plotille, minkä se saa, niin sitten se yleensä laittaa nimekseen, että etunimi sitten joku tyyli Duke of ja sitten sukunimen tilalle tulee se paikan nimi, niin sitten siitä tulee lyhennyksenä niin etunimi paikan nimi, niin se ei enää niin kuulu siihen nimidynastiaan. Niin sillain niitä syntyy niitä uusia sukuja, jotka on kuitenkin täysin niitä niin kuin vanhan biologisia sukulaisia. Mutta ne on kuitenkin niin kuin periaatteessa siinä vassalointisopimuksessa niin ensiksi velvoitettu katsomaan, että sillä omalla alueella menee hyvin, eikä se, että sillä niin kuin ylemmällä menee hyvin. Sitten jos se ei haittaa sitä omaa aluetta, niin sit sitä ylempää pitää seurata ensiksi ja sen jälkeen katsoa ne kaikki muut. Mutta sillä, että jos sillä on se, että sillä on se biologinen claimi siihen, että se joku esivanhempi jostakin on esimerkiksi se ja se, sen esimerkiksi alaikäinen lapsi on niin kuin kahden suvun sillä, että siitä tulee sekä se niin kuin suvun sopima, että siitä niin kuin periaatteessa se, miten kaikki näkee niistä marriage-sopimuksista menevän. Niin sit siitä tulee yleensä se niin kuin sen alueen tyyliin ruhtinas. Ja sitten se saa tehdä siellä, mitä se haluaa. periaatteessa, jos ei se sitä itseä haittaa, niin siitä oletetaan, että se auttaisi sitä ylempää, mutta sitä ei pidä tehdä, jos se vähänkään haittaa. Siinä on semmoinen, että jos ylempi pyytää, että sä mobilisoidut ja se on joku sun rajatyyppi, jonka kanssa käyt kauppaan, niin sä voit tyyliin lähettää niille kirtuun lisää rahaa ja sanoa, että tässä on sen verran, mitä mä teen voittoa tästä kaupasta. Mutta jos mä tämän kaupan lopetan, niin tää kyllä tuhoutuu. Sitten sä voit alkaa sen sun oman ruhtinaankaan neuvottelemaan niistä sun mobilisoitumisen ehdoista ja se on sitten taas ihan eri peli. Se ei ole mikään semmoinen, että nyt meet rynkyn katon, että me ammutaan sut juttu. Vaan se on sillä, että sä niin neuvottelet, että millä ehdoilla sä lähet sinne sotaan. Sitten jos sä digaat, niin sit sä lähet. Feodaalit toimii sillä. Sen takia niissä pyhissä sodissa on aina vittu 100 000 sotilasta ja sitten kun joku Ruotsin ja Tanskan kuningas sotii keskenään, niin niillä on joku 3000 armeija. Sitten kun katsotaan sitä, kun ne meidän aikajanassa, siis tässä primary-aikajanassa, kun nämä skandinaavit soti sen viimeisen Astaratu-temppelin ympärillä siellä jossain, muistaakseni Ruotsissa, niin kun ne tiesi, että ne on jo hävinnyt sen, mutta ne kaikki viimeiset uskovaiset kerääntyi sinne, niin siellä oli yli 20 000 viikinkiä. Niitä niin kuin sillä, että ne oli kaikki niin kuin chainmailit ja sillä, että ne oli niin kuin ihan viimeisen päällä. Ne tiesi, että ne oli hävinnyt sen, kun ne katolilaiset sitten lopussa hävitti ne kaikki, jotka ei suostunut kääntymään. Sen takia niissä on niin paljon sitä katolilaisuutta ja niin vähän niitä muita, niin nämä tekee näin hirmuuskoa. Sen takia, kun mä tiedän uskolla, joka on se Suomi, Saami, Viro ja niin mä oon niille sillä, että joko me mennään tuohon, että me otetaan katolilaisuus, kaikki kääntyy ja me hävitetään kaikki ne, jotka ei käänny, tai sitten me yritetään. Niin se on se mun Crusader Kingsin yhdessä. Koska kun se tulee se reformointiuskonto, niin joutuu semmoisia muutoksia tekemään, että pääsee niiden katolilaisten kanssa, ettei se mene semmoiseksi, että ne tekee loputtomasti niitä crusadeja, koska sen kyllä niin siellä pitää jotakin yhtäläisyyksiä olla. Katolilaiset on esimerkiksi hirveän tarkkoja tuosta lähiverisuhteesta. Että jos haluaa tuohon maailman aikaan kirkon hyväksynnän valtiona, niin laittaa vaikka, että se on niin kuin 8 degrees of separation on hetkinen 5 enemmän kuin mitä meillä on nyt, ja silloin on vasta joku 2% populaatiosta konsa niin kuin sillä, että niiden kai ei pysty olemaan, kun ne on liian lähiverisiä. Silloin puhutaan 1,25% on samaa kuin läheisellä. Meillä hyväksytään cousin once removed melkein kaikissa länsimaissa. Silloin on 12,5% samaa DNA:ta. Ja sitten ihmisen ja jonkun orangin välillä niin on joku tyyliin prosenttiero DNA:ssa. Niin jos sä mietit, että sä prosentin mogaati päädyt orangiksi tai prosentin mogaati teet jonkun lähikasenin kanssa, niin onhan se nyt vähän silloin. Kun me tiedetään, että meidän sivilisaatiossa ei pitäisi niitä lähijuttuja tehdä. Se tekee se Quarien ja muutama semmosia, että ne tekee niitä niin kuin lähes pelkästään niitä lähijuttuja, mutta se on vähän eri settingi kuin mikä meillä on. Niin jos haluaa läntisen kirkon kanssa hyvät välit, niin sit pitää ainakin bestiality kieltää ja sitten lähiavioliitot. Ne pitää ainakin kieltää. Sitten concubineista pitäisi päästä polygamiin. Siinä on ne, mitä joutuu kiristämään. Mutta siellä on paljon semmoisia, joita pystyy avaamaan. Sitten mä tein kans niin, että murder saman dynastin sisällä niin on major crime. Se on niinku toi heresi. siinä on näitä sama family, mutta mä laitan näitä saman dynastian sisällä. Mun mielestä Honorable Combat on sit ihan asia erikseen. Murder on se, mistä mä puhutaan. Sit pystyy ainakin teoriassa, kun ne sit digaa siitä vähemmän, niin sit jos semmoista tapahtuu, että se delaa se hyvä hahmo ja sieltä pääsee joku cousin third remove, niin sit vaan laittaa sen se imprisanaan niin itsensä. Kun siellä on se attempt suicide option, niin sit laittaa sen heti. Koska mä en halua rikkoa sitä sillä lailla, että mä en niin tekisi sitä itselleen. Siinä ei ole mitään mun mielestä semmosia honorable applicationeja tai semmosia. Niin se on vähän sillä lailla rujasti tehty se niiden systeemi. Niin mä teen nyt sillä lailla, kun mä juttelin tässä näiden skandinaavien kanssa, että miten tää onnistuisi, että mä laitan sinne saamelais-duchy-alueelle niin saamelaistaustaisen äijähallintaan niin ja lisään siihen. Ja sitten kun mä teen siitä sen saamelaiskingdomin, jonka mä laitan Kingdom of Scandinaviaan, jonka mä muodostan siitä, kun mulla on ne 2 kingdomia itselläni. Ja niin mä laitan siihen Finland Kingdomin viereensä. Mä en laita sitä niin kuin Kingdom of Finlandia alle, vaan mä laitan sen Kingdom of Scandinavian alle. Sitten kun se on tehty ja mä oon sieltä idästä saanut ne ukonuskoalueet sen verran, kun niitä nyt ehtii sieltä Novgorodilta ottaa, niin sit mä alan katsoa sitä, että jos mä valtaisin vaikka kun Ruotsia kääntäisin ne takas siihen Astaratuun. Se ei kyllä tule onnistua. Siinä tulee käymään huonosti. Se on melko varma juttu. Kun se olisi vähän ehkä liikaa jopa tuohon aikaan. Siinäpä he kääntyvät, jos itse sitä haluavat. Se on ehkä vähän järkevämpi kelata niin. Kyllä mä ainakin sen ukonusko-alueen yritän pelastaa. Sitten mä vaan teen niin, että mä otan sinne hoviin ne, jotka sieltä Skandinaavian alueelta lähtee pakoon. Kun sinne hoviin tulee vitusti jengiä koko ajan, vähänkin kun on sitä, että jengi tietää kuka sä oot, niin sinne oikein kerääntyy sitä kööriivyt. Tulee ihan vitusti jengiä. Siinä on pelkästään niitä champion-rooleja, eli niitä, että ne istuu siellä sun sotilaiden kanssa ja jeesaa niitä ja sillain. Niitä mulla oli lopussa 18, mitä mä pystyin laittamaan, ja mulla oli joku 25 semmoista koko täyden hovityöntekijän listan jälkeen, jotka oli vielä sillä, että niillä ei ole mitään duunia, mutta ne loput oli niin huonoja, että mä jouduin laittamaan ne automaattisesti siihen, että ne ei saa edes mennä sinne kentälle. Sitten siihen jäi niiden huonojen ja sitten niiden jälkeen, jotka automaattisesti laitetaan sinne kentälle, niin joku 10 varmaan, 50 semmoista, jotka voisit, jos joku haavoittuu, niin ottaa sen roolin siellä kentällä. Ja mulla oli hovi ihan täynnä, että jokaiselle työntekijälle oli rooli. Ja mulla oli kaikilla työntekijöillä niin joku 15-20 pistettä se niiden oman alan osaamisen arvo, ja mun johtajalla oli se, mitä mä olin eniten kouluttanut, niin 22 sen oman alansa siinä vaiheessa, kun se kuoli vanhuuteen siis. Naisjohtaja, jonka mä otin 0-vuotiaana johtajaksi, kun mä niinku inkarnoidun siihen. Ja sit pelasin sillä, että mä otin alkuattribuuteiksi pelkästään niitä, jotka on hyviä perinnöllisiä attribuutteja, eli näitä kaunis, terve, viisas ja niin eteenpäin. Sitten kun mä koulutin sitä sillä, että kun siinä tulee niitä eventtejä, kun se kysyy, että mitä sä teet tässä tilanteessa ja mitä sä teet tässä tilanteessa, niin koko ajan kaikki semmoiset calm, temperate, wise, medic, forgiving ja niin kuin semmoiset attribuutit. niin siitä tuli semmoinen uskonnollinen ikoni siihen loppuun mennessä, mutta sillä ei silti ollut sitä uskonnollista vaikutusvaltaa niin paljon, että olisi voinut reformoida se oma uskonnon. Niin siinä todennäköisesti menee vielä aika pitkään, että mä saan sen siihen pisteeseen, että se muuttuu varsinaiseksi kuningaskunnaksi, kun se on niinku tribal-alue, jolla on yksi semmoinen se naisjohtaja ollut, joka sai niinku käännettyä ne kaikki muut siihen omaan leiriinsä ja sitten julisti sen kuningaskunnan, mutta se on silti tribal. Siitä alueesta oli huipussaan niin pelkästään sen omassa hallinnassa niin vaan kolmannes. Muu kuuluu niille muille aatelisille koko ajan. Sitten kun se delasi, niin ne muut aateliset peri semmosia pieniä plotteja siltä rajalta ja se päämiesperillinen niin peri sen niin keskiosan tai sen, mikä jäi niiden muiden kulmien väliin semmoiseksi langaksi, mistä pääsee joka alueelle. Nyt käyttäen niitä feodaalioikeuksia, niin voisi tehdä niin, että ottaisi joltakin sen oman kuningaskunnan pois ja lisäisi sen siihen. Niin kuin, eikö se oli naisperillinen se, joka sai sen kuningaskunnan, niin ottaisi joltakin niin perimysoikeuksilla sen kuningaskunnan ja siirtäisi sen sinne hoviin tekemään. Mutta siinä on nyt sillä, että se uusi johtaja ei ole mitenkään yhtä hyvä hallinnointinero kuin se edellinen. Kun mä keskitin sen edellisen siihen hallinnointiin, niin se ylittäisi sen kapasiteetin, kuinka paljon se osaa hallinnoida niitä alueita samaan aikaan, niin se ei ole hyvä idea. Jos mä saan sen jotenkin järkevästi se hallinnointikapasiteetti, niin mä teen aina niin, että mä inherittaan sen isoimman, ei mun alla olevan domainin ja sitten otan siitä 2/3 ja annan 1/3 niin noille muille aatelisille, jotka on semmoisessa jamassa, että ne tarvii sitä ja sitten että ne osaa myös hallinnoida sitä. Ja sitten aina kun mä vapautan sen yhden niistä tehtävistä, niin mä teen niin, että mä kierrätän kaikki hoviduunit uudestaan sen jälkeen, kun kaikki on saanut ne omat domaininsa ja niistä sen jälkeen näkee, että kuinka hyvät ne on niiden bonuksiensa kanssa ja näin poispäin. Niin sit mä laitan vaan ne parhaat aina, jotka pystyy niiden muiden töiden lomassa. Niin siinä on hyvä sauma, että se edellinen domaini niin saattaa saada jollekin rintaperilliselle, niin se oman domaininsa periaatteessa takaisin, eli se ei lähde siltä suvulta. Ja sitten sen lisäksi niin hyvin korkealla todennäköisyydellä pääsee johonkin tyyliin stewardin rooliin, missä niin kuin käytännössä se on sun tehtävä hallinnoida sitä aluetta. Niin kuin sitä koko valtioaluetta ja sitten pääset hallinnoimaan, eli siis korruptoimaan, niin jonkun 3-4 kertaa sen sun kokoisen alueen. Niin se on vähän sillä, että miten sä nyt reagoit siihen, että sä menetät se alue. Palkka nousee niin paljon, että et usko ikinä vettä. Sitten siinä on sillä, että jos siinä tulee se Dark Magic-kysymys tai eventti tree, niin sulla on teoriassa mahdollisuus tehdä siitä sun hahmosta kuolematon. Se on semmoinen Dark Magic-juttu, jonka kanssa voi alkaa pelleilemään, mutta mä en ole tehnyt sitä. Mä oon noussut vähän matkaa sitä puuta ylöspäin, sit sanonut, että olipa mielenkiintoisia kirjoja ja tehnyt kirjastoja ja poistunut siltä alalta. Sitten silloin tällöin pitänyt semmosia witch meettejä, jossa ne niin tekee jotain, mutta ei mitään semmoista, että lähtisi tekemään niitä spellejä, millä siinä saattaa saada jotakin, tai sitten se jysähtää ihan täysin. Kun tuossa Ukon uskossa witchcraft on hyväksytty, ja sitä mä nyt varmasti annan pois. Se on ihan selvää, että se pysyy. Bestiality on tällä hetkellä laitonta, mutta mä veikkaan, että mä joudun pitämään sen laittomana, vaikka mä tekisin sillä itse mitä, niin sen takia, kun siinä on se kristitty kirkko vieressä. Niin niiden opinioni laskee sen mukaan, kuinka paljon sä eroat niiden siitä virallisesta kirkkonormistosta, ja jos se on riittävän matala, niin ne sitten tekee niitä krusadeja niin pitkään, että ne kyllä voittaa sut lopulta. Niin pitää tehdä sillä, että menee sinne oman tulkinnan niin kuin niiden ääripäähän sillä, että kuitenkin hyväksyy ne vaihtoehdot ja sitten vaan venää ja katsoo, että tuleeko ne vai eikö ne tule. Se on sitä suomettumista.
February 16th, 1940.
Kun se iskuvoima on aika kova.
For 2.5 months, Finland has held out against the might of the Soviet Union's Red Army, but the weight of numbers finally tells. This week, the Mannerheim line breaks.
That's about a month into the war.
I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Allied Supreme Council decided it will intervene in Norway and Finland in mid-March. However, the Soviets just launched a renewed offensive against the Finns, and though the defenses hold, for how long could they withstand the strain? The Soviets are attacking with what Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Kliment Voroshilov has called the crescendo offensive. This is just wave after wave after wave of troops attacking again and again. On the 10th and 11th, the attacks on the Karelian Isthmus, already colossal in scope, widened to include every sector from the Gulf of Finland to Taipale. The whole front is under assault. The Russians even try to widen the assault further by sending men in flanking maneuvers out on the ice. These fail, though, and the coastal heavy battery, which only has shells that could pierce battleships, smashes and shatters the ice, freezing or drowning hundreds of Russians sunk into the black water by their heavy gear. Over the next few days, the Soviets try to bring tanks or field guns against the shore batteries, but the attacks again fail, and in one instance, all 25 tanks attacking are either put out of action or sent through the ice. On the other end of the front at Taipale, it's the same story, as the Soviets fail to outflank the Finns from Lake Ladoga. And yet, by sundown on the 11th, a Russian breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line has become a reality. See, in order to conserve the rested Finnish 5th Division for when it is really needed, every report of a possible Russian breakthrough is thoroughly analyzed as to its real danger, to the point that when that danger comes, it goes unnoticed until it's too late. It's even reported without much urgency, together with a bunch of other reports that sound a lot worse. It comes on the Lade Road, northeast of Suma. A Finnish battalion relieves the one that has held the sector since late January and is no longer capable of any serious resistance. But the replacement battalion itself is only at 40% strength. The only real defensive fortifications remaining there are two structures that dominate the approach, the $1 Million Bunker and the Poppius Bunker. The new battalion takes over at night and is unfamiliar with the terrain. This night also happens to be the night Soviet commander Semyon Timoshenko moves 18 fresh divisions and 5 tank brigades into the lines along the whole isthmus. At Lade, the Soviet 123rd Division brings in artillery pieces, doing it by hand to not alert the Finns, and has flat trajectory guns aimed dead on the Finnish defenses. Their main job is to take out one or both of the main posts. They're attacking here instead of at Suma because Not only is Summa way tougher, but a breakthrough here would in fact cause the Finns to abandon Summa anyhow. And if the Soviets can break through the second line, about a kilometer deep, they can take the road junctions that are the key to the whole sector. When the morning comes, a 2.5-hour artillery barrage announces the attack. At noon, Leningrad time, the infantry begins its assault. The first attack on Popius quickly fails, but fresh battalions are sent in, and Soviet tanks drive up and park in front of the Popius firing ports. Now, earlier, it would have been a poor tactic, as the Finns' Molotov cocktails and Bofors guns would have knocked out the tanks. But by now, the Soviet infantry armor coordination is solid, and each tank is covered by plenty of men with automatic weapons. That prevents the cocktails. And all of the Bofors guns in the whole region have been knocked out. The Finns soon have no choice but to flee the bunker and fight from the local earthworks. At 12:30, a red banner rises above Popius. On the Finnish left, the swamp is too heavy for armor, so it's only Russian infantry that assaults what's called the Valley of Death. But when Soviet tanks begin to arrive there from behind from the Lade Road, the Finns are forced to pull back there as well. Only at the $1 million bunker on the right do the Finnish positions hold. The fighting lasts all day and all night, and the defenders hold. Even when the bunker is surrounded and men try climbing in through the firing holes, the defenses hold. 5 a.m. though, Soviet sappers managed to stick a 230-kilo block of TNT over a shellfire crack on the main chamber's roof. The blast kills every single man inside. At noon, the remainder of the position's defenders, now fewer than 50, managed to withdraw, still in good order, to the support line. By the evening of that second day, the Red Army has consolidated the Lade Road salient. It is the only part of the whole line that the attacks of the 11th have really been successful. The Finnish counterattack on Lade comes on the 13th, but it's too little and too late. It is not the whole 5th Division either. Mannerheim planned to throw all 3 regiments of the division in, but he had to peel off 2 of them for other emergencies. Had they gone in on the 11th, it seems likely that Lade would have held. But that's a what if. What does happen then is a Soviet armored attack that breaks through and sees a wedge of 50 tanks crash into the Finnish rear. Soon, they have a clear run over good ground to Viipuri, Finland's second largest city. But they stop and wait for other units to catch up. This is a chance for total victory, and they do not take it. William Trotter thinks this is probably because they cannot believe that the road really lies open and that the Finnish defenses are as battered as they actually are. Whatever the reason is, by the time they get moving, the moment is lost, as the Finns have shored up their defenses.
Bauhausin kylpymaailmapäiviltä löydät satoja tuotteita laatumerkeiltä jopa 25% alennuksella.
In my game, such a breakthrough would have meant absolutely nothing because in my gameplay, Scandinavia, I can only assign about 2/3 of my army to the Eastern Front at the same time. The remaining 1/3 are in reserve because the supply at the front is insufficient to have them there at the same time. But further close to the supply centers, further away from the front, they can actually maintain full organization. And I have about 1/3 of my army with the very same gear at the start of the war at the back of the front. And in fact, I usually wait until 2 divisions are both at below 50% strength and unify them into 1 division where they are usually at around 75 because there are items that are not common to the equipment that are not unifiable as such. But they usually get at around 75% strength and about 10% of normal divisions in surplus to the units in the rear. And then bring up 1 unit with 100% strength to the front line. Until then, my front line is usually at its maximum supply. As in, everybody is doing everything that can be done. Nothing can be done more than what is being done.
Attack is considered for that night. But with no artillery and no cover, it is abandoned as hopeless. On the 14th, the Soviets widened the Lade salient, putting pressure on Summa from the rear and causing the Finns to begin withdrawing from Summa. After 70 days, of holding out against everything the Red Army had to throw at them. They managed to withdraw without alerting the Soviets, and on the 15th, a massive attack on Suma finds no defenders to fight. Apparently, when Joseph Stalin is told that Suma has fallen, he does not believe it until an actual eyewitness tells him he has seen the red flag flying high in person. 4 p.m. on February 15th, Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim orders a general retreat of the Finnish Second Corps to the intermediate line. There are ramifications beyond the local ones. On the 12th, the Soviets raised their terms in peace negotiations with the Finns after successes in the field. Actually, the Soviets aren't just negotiating with the Finns. On the 11th, the USSR and Germany sign another trade and economic agreement. The USSR will supply raw materials like oil and food. Germany will supply manufactured ones like weapons. The Soviets will get blueprints of the most recent naval armaments and prototypes of most recent tanks, planes, and AA guns. Hitler agrees with this, partly because he wants to keep the USSR neutral as long as possible so he can win in the West. He even hands over the blueprints for the Bismarck, Germany's most advanced battleship. Actually, there is notable action at sea this week. On February 16th, on First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's instructions, the British destroyer Cossack enters Norwegian waters and takes 299 British prisoners from the German transport ship Altmark. The Altmark has been in Norwegian waters since the 14th. By international law, should have released its prisoners. However, Altmark's captain claimed he had no prisoners, and the Norwegians made no real search attempt of the ship. Thing is, Altmark has spent time as the supply ship to German pocket battleship Graf Spee that was scuttled off the Uruguayan coast 2 months ago, as we saw. And that's why it now has the prisoners. At first encounter, the Cossack withdraws, since the Norwegians say they have checked and found no prisoners on the Altmark. But Churchill sends the Cossack back. A boarding party fights its way aboard the Altmark after it has been run aground, and several Germans are killed. What the British do here is also against international law, and though this action is very popular at home, it helps further convince the Germans that the British have plans afoot for Norway and gives them impetus for their own invasion plans. The Cossacks' captain, Philip Bayan, is awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Norway formally protests the British violating Norwegian territorial waters. The British reply that Norway has violated international law by allowing the Germans to use its waters to transport British prisoners to Germany. Plans, machinations, and deceit everywhere. For example, Soviet agent Richard Sorge, or should I say German journalist Richard Sorge. Well, they're both the same guy. He's in Japan and has close contacts with the German embassy there. See, Stalin has to keep in mind anything going on in the Far East when he's making plans in the Far West. The Soviet Union does share a large border with the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, and Japan's military strength and intentions have to figure into his plans. So on the 16th, Sorge sends Moscow a very detailed account of Japanese military production output, planes, trucks, etc., a report on the factories that make them, and even a report on Japanese iron and steel production. That will end the week, with a British rescue in Norwegian waters, new agreements between Germany and the USSR, and the breaking of the Mannerheim Line. But can you believe it held this long against pretty much the largest army on Earth? But let's be clear here. Breaking a defensive line and defeating an entire nation are two very different things. Thought I'd leave you with that thought. As many of you know, our maps are made by eStory. If you haven't done so, check out his own videos and his channel. You can start with this one about the Estonian War of Independence. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Hart Poole. The money you support us with in the Army finances this show. Join our Army at timeghost.tv or at Patreon. See you next time. Yeah, it's an old artillery barracks. Yes, that's what they're going to do with it. Okay, bye. February 23rd, 1940. Adolf Hitler's armies have been inactive in the field since October, but he's making plans for the spring. In fact, He's making plans to invade not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 different nations. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, a British destroyer entered Norwegian waters, boarded a German transport ship, and recovered 299 prisoners. Everyone protested that everyone was breaking international law. Everyone was. The big news, though, was that the huge Soviet offensive against the Finns had finally broken a hole in the Mannerheim defense line, and at the end of the week, the Finns began their retreat to the intermediate line. Its strength, though, varies widely depending just where you are. On the Viipuri Gateway, it's as strong as the Mannerheim line had been. Other sections are what one calls colored lines on a map. In general, though, it is thin, not very well reinforced with concrete, and the troops defending it are absolutely exhausted. However, it's not until the 17th that the two sides really meet along the whole line, which has given the Finns a short respite to plant mines, throw up what new defenses they can, get their Bofors guns sighted on the roads where the Soviet tanks will arrive. By the 18th, the Soviets are there in force, making savage attack.
I always like to remember a particular story I heard about Mannerheim. There was a situation during some of the hardest fightings in the Mannerheim line, and at one point the generals, etc., came to him all fired up about things going wrong, and he looked at everybody and just said, "Everybody get 8 hours of sleep. We'll meet in the morning." And I like to recall that particular story, like not taking 2 hours of sleep during a time of crisis, working 2 weeks straight on like 3 hours of sleep a night at most, but rather during the hardest parts of the crisis, giving everybody a night's sleep. As the story goes, once they had a full night's sleep, they realized that the situation was not nearly as bad as they thought. That's the story anyway.
There is still one part of the Mannerheim line that holds, though, the left flank over at Taipale. And this is a pretty tempting target for the Soviets. I mean, Taipale is becoming a salient that the Soviet right is outpacing as it advances. If the Finns have any reserve divisions to throw in, this is the perfect place to seriously hurt the Soviets. So the Soviets decide to try to eliminate the salient once and for all. The 18th is known by the Finns as the Black Day at Taipale, as an entire Soviet division runs roughshod over a regiment of Finnish rookie replacements. But though the Soviets take some big strong points and certainly damage the position, the Finnish veterans in the support line still hold the sector through the end of the week. There is a shakeup in the Finnish High Command on the 19th. General Hugo Osterman, commander on the Karelian Isthmus, resigns, ostensibly for reasons of health, but he has not been in Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim's good books lately, and his wife has just been badly wounded in an air raid. Mannerheim then passes over the next in line for command, General Ökvist, and appoints Erich Heinrichs. But there is a consolidation as well. The 1st and 2nd divisions are now grouped as the 1st Army Corps, positioned between the 2nd and 3rd Corps, and Ökvist's 2nd Corps will now concentrate on the defense of Viipuri. A different prize is soon to fall to the Soviets. As the week nears its end, anybody can see that Koivisto Island will soon be cut off. The Finns' coastal batteries there have done huge damage to any and all Soviet traffic on the coastal roads for weeks. An all-out assault, and the defenders are needed elsewhere, so on the 23rd they begin to evacuate, firing off just about every shell they have and blowing up what they cannot carry. Of course, the Red Army can then move up the coastal roads, and by the end of the day are taking advanced positions beyond Koivisto Island. Ökvist asks Mannerheim if he should draw up plans for a retreat to the rear defense line, just in case. But Mannerheim says no. As William Trotter points out, there are plenty of Finnish officers that think Mannerheim is just being stubborn, but he knows that every inch of Finnish soil the Finnish army can hold gives them that much more leverage at the peace negotiating table. Also, the rear line, the last line of defense, runs through Viipuri itself, and every day they do not have to defend there means a day the city can be built up and improved. Here's something I didn't have time to mention last week. Väinö Tanner, Finnish foreign minister, was in Stockholm and received a resounding no to his plea for Swedish military aid or for allied military units to cross Sweden. The Swedish government said they were concerned about possible German intervention if they agreed to this, but that's actually about as close to a lie as you could get. Sweden's actual motives were cold-blooded in the extreme. Finland would be forced to make peace with Russia in order to preserve its independence, which would leave the nation of Finland in place as an armed buffer between Sweden and the Soviet giant. None of the Swedish diplomats involved in this policy found it easy to stomach. There it was in a nutshell. The last thing Sweden wanted was to encourage further resistance. Well, as last week turned to this week, a Swedish newspaper breaks the story of Tanner's trip, his plea, and the reason he was refused. This causes a whole lot of outrage in both Sweden and Finland, to the point where Swedish King Gustav V gets involved. He expresses his regret that they can or will not send aid, but if they do, they might well be dragged into one or both of the current European wars. This pretty much ends the chance that popular opinion will lead to Swedish military intervention. The German Foreign Office gets hold of Tanner and offers to mediate in peace talks with the Soviets. That offer will be withdrawn, and it is because of Hitler's impending Norway campaign, since he doesn't really care how long the Winter War lasts, as long as he still has good relations with the USSR. And his Norway plans are kicking into gear this week. German intelligence has read Britain's naval reports of the Anglo-French plan, decided back on the 5th, to send military forces to Norway on or around March 20th. General Niklaus von Falkenhorst is now assigned to prepare the German invasion plan. He quickly concludes that they need to take Denmark as well as a bridge to Norway and to secure communications. I say quickly because when Hitler gives him the assignment, he is told to make the basic plan by the end of the day. So apparently he uses a Baedeker tourist guide of Norway to plan it, since its maps are the only ones he can get with such short notice. The plan is to land German troops at 7 different Norwegian locations, including Oslo, the capital. As for those side plans, British troops that were preparing to go to France are told they have a new destination, one that includes ice and snow, for which their training will soon begin. Fort Stratford is the name of the planned military expedition to Finland through Norway. Well, Hitler is making all sorts of plans this week. On the 17th, he meets with General Erich von Manstein. Here's the thing. Manstein had been made a corps commander to get him out of the way of planning for the German offensive in the West, as we saw. But protocol dictates that upon appointment, corps commanders pay respect to the head of state, Adolf Hitler. But this is really just a formality, right? Well, here, chance intervenes. John Keegan writes that Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's Wehrmacht adjutant, happens to go by Manstein's Koblenz headquarters and gets wind of Manstein's idea for an attack through the Ardennes. This is pretty much also Hitler's idea, but a lot better and more precisely planned. So the formality of meeting becomes an entire morning between Hitler and Manstein. Hitler was entranced, converted, and thereafter did not rest until Brauchitsch and Halder too had accepted the Manstein plan, which he passed off as his own conception. But if the war was going to get a lot more active, a lot of people didn't believe it. On the 20th, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in his diary, "The war machine is running in neutral. Only yesterday, a sergeant was telling me, with a gleam of insane hope in his eyes, what I think is, it'll all be arranged. England will climb down." 1.5 million British women and children were evacuated from the large cities in the fall, in case of German bombing, but by Christmas, most of them had returned home because nothing was happening. It still wasn't happening. And yet, Unknown to them, planning for resuming the active war was growing week after week. This week, certainly a big one for Hitler's planning, ends. Sweden refusing to aid the Finns, the Soviet attacks on the Finns still grinding away, slowly but inexorably pushing them back, and the Finns reorganizing and reconsolidating just to hold on to what they can for as long as they can. I'll end a little differently today with another piece of news rather than a conclusion. On the 21st, Richard Glücks tells Heinrich Himmler he's found a good site for a quarantine camp, a place to imprison.
Finland got through the entire Winter War about 2 divisions worth of equipment and volunteers. That's about 6 brigades. And the Ukrainians are getting about a brigade a day. So if you are to measure whether or not the world community has learned in terms of the force required to push the initial attack instead of slowly building up and losing 65 million people in these cases, then I hope we'll see something interesting. And we'll see, but I hope we'll see something interesting. Slash.
You've left yourself
Oben. Oben. Help me, Oben. There we go. Deep one. think I'm about done for this podcast. Ooh.